haunts me. It haunts me. I hate it. So yeah, no. Anyway, we digress. So, okay. Yeah, Dropbox, Jessica, that's a good idea. All right. So our goal as health psychologists, right? And many of you have seen these slides before, the slide before. This is actually from NIH, from their RDoc. So they're trying to integrate across biological systems. And so our goal should be to understand a phenomenon in terms of how genes influence proteins, influence cellular systems, that influence neural systems, that influence psychology, that influence behavior, that influence a health outcome or a syndrome. And then all that's happening bidirectionally, right? So we know that behavior and stress and can influence even our genes, right? Can't change our genetics, but it turns on which genes turn on and off. So it's bidirectional. And all this is happening, of course, in a changing environment. And so this is kind of, some people have argued that, you know, health psychology does have a good model for this. It's called the biopsychosocial approach. But if you've ever read the like biopsychosocial approaches, they basically just say that all these things should go together, but they don't give us a guide as to how or why. And what we really need is a meta theory about like why stress would lead to one outcome, but it doesn't lead to another outcome. Why should social environments influence which genes get turned on and turned off? I mean, that's just crazy, right? So it's like just saying these three things are related. It's not really a theory. The biopsychosocial approach is just, it's not a theory. It's just like a method, but it's not a theory of how these things relate together. So evolution gives us that. So that's why we're going into a dive in that today. Evolution's so simple. I love this idea. So Charles Darwin writes this, trying to figure out why species are different, and like how did species become the way they are. Through multiple observations of different islands in the Galapagos, specifically looking at finches that were obviously shared a common ancestor, but had, you know, were slightly different depending on the environment. From there, he was like, okay, these three things can lead to speciation. First is you need to have variation in a population. How does that occur? Well, sometimes there's random mutations, right, in our alleles, our genes, and that leads to slightly different protein structure, and that leads to a slightly different organism. And so we've got variation. That's easy. No one's going to argue that variation exists in human populations or any other population. So that's number one of the evolutionary recipe. Number two is there needs to be some competition amongst individuals. So if we put like all humans, you know, in the perfect utopia, and they don't have to compete, and they have like perfect access to resources and wonderful healthcare, we can like build them a new liver if their liver's broken, right? If we could do that, then it does, but then there wouldn't be any competition. But in terms of living in a natural world, there's always going to be some competition for resources and some competition for survival. And organisms, of course, that don't survive, so if they have a mutation that's like fatal, they're obviously not going to live to have babies. And so if there's differential rates of reproduction, so some organisms have more babies than others, that's step two in the evolution recipe. Step three is just the insight that organisms that have an advantage over other organisms in terms of that they've survived and reproduced are more likely to pass on those advantages to their children. So we have to have heritability too. So if there was no link between like genetics, like the thing that led to that animal surviving couldn't be passed down, then you couldn't have evolutionary theory. But because we know that that's true in genetic studies, right, you can do selective breeding and get the trait you want. There's definitely heritability thanks to genes. Yeah, so it's just those three things: variation in the population, differential rates of reproduction, and heritability. If you have those three things, you have natural selection will take place. And so over time, individuals that derived from the same ancestor, if they're separated, let's say in a different environment or fill a different ecological niche, even within the same environment, they'll, if they have enough generations where they're not intermating, are going to lead to differential speciation over time. So this is just in pictures because I like pictures. So number one, we've got variation. So let's imagine we've got these beetles, right? They're living in this environment. It's like this brown background. We've got a blue beetle, we've got a green beetle, and we've got a brown beetle. Just like, let's imagine it's like hair color, right? We've got some blondes, we've got some brunettes, we got some redheads, we got some black hair. Great. And that's fine. But let's imagine, right, that suddenly there's some crazy predator that evolves and is going to come down and try to eat people. Then hair and attack us from above. Then hair color might actually make a difference, right? The blondes, maybe they glint in the sun more. And so the predator is going to pick off the blondes first. And so the same would be true here. So now there's no, we can have lots of variation, doesn't really make a difference in terms of how much you survive and reproduce. But if an environment changes so that a new predator is involved, let's say, or and changes in any way, then traits that were just six a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other, like just different ways to skin a cat or whatever, there's variation in those alleles. If it turns out that, let's say, a predator comes in and now they're hungry and they want to eat these beetles. And so they're getting at, there's competition for resources and there's competition amongst who's not someone else's dinner. So one person's going to be that predator's dinner, one person's not. And so because the birds will pick off the green and the blue ones because they're easier to see, because of that, only the brown ones survive. And then that's selection. And then you got reproduction, next generations. There's no blue and green beetles to mate. The brown ones are the only ones still around. So now we have an overabundance of brown compared to before the introduction of that predator. And so you just take that cycle over and over and over and over, thousands of times, millions of times, and you can get quite dramatic changes in the variation in the population over time. So much so that new species will arise. And a species is defined as members of the same species can mate and have offspring that are themselves able to mate. And so once you have a population that's, no longer intermating, that's a new species. Questions about natural selection? This is different than artificial selection. So humans are really good at artificially selecting for things. So controlling kind of which animals get to mate and choosing the traits we want. This is not natural selection. So don't get confused between crops and pets. They're not good examples of natural selection at work. Sexual selection is a form of natural selection. This is just traits that helped one sex reproduce more so than another member of their same sex, or helped in their competition to get mates of the opposite sex. So it's like a trait that helps you get mates. This is the cause of most of the sex differences in humans. So for example, males are, much larger in humans than females are on average. They're much taller, in part because males who are larger were better able to fight and compete for other males. And so because of that, they were able to have access to females. And then females over time prefer larger males. So if you go in and ask women, what they find sexy, you're much more likely to have a one-night stand if you're, with a guy who's over 6 feet than you would if they're 5'9". In general, there's individual variation, right? And many risky behaviors are linked to sexual selection. So for example, binge drinking or things we might be interested in health psychologists like smoking or jumping off a cliff, cliff diving, doing dangerous things, not getting a vaccine, let's say, may be linked to sexual selection trait. And a lot of the things we find beautiful are linked to what's called good genes or indicators of health and fertility. So for example, having clear skin. is a synonymous with not having been exposed to pathogens, for example, or having like good hormone balance that would lead to fertility. And so we look for cues like a curvy woman, like waist hip ratio. Turns out like having larger hips, especially with our huge heads, right, is associated with more likelihood of surviving childbirth. And having that nice fat distribution at the hips too is really good for ensuring that the baby's going to have enough, a good healthy brain and the mom. So there's a lot of things that we like that, yeah, it's a classic example. Yeah. Hey girl, I respect your mate value so much. Extra pair copulations wouldn't even cross my mind. So just an example of a silly meme, but thinking about these traits from an evolutionary perspective, this is an example of that. All right. So key things about evolution is evolution does not have a plan. It is a blind tinkerer, meaning that there's no master plan of kind of that evolution doesn't want us to get anywhere. It's just a natural process that's taking place, right? Kind of like, when there's a hurricane or something, it's not like the hurricane's mad or upset or has a plan to destroy a city. It's just going to destroy a city because there's natural forces at work and they have to play out. The same thing's true of evolution, right? So we're not going to probably end up, with the ability to teleport or fly, through. That's not part of in part because it's also subject to just the natural forces at work. Also, the variation has to exist. So evolution doesn't create variation. So only variation that exists can be what selected force. So if there's not a mutation so that like someone can fly, then there's never going to be natural selection for flight in humans, right? That has to be there already. So because of that, you get a lot of less than optimal solutions. And I'll show you some examples of cases like the eye and the back in humans where evolution could only work with what it had, already. And there was natural variation in what was already there. And one was a little bit better, but it doesn't lead to perfect design solutions. And I think this is surely true in psychology as well. So there's something called kludge. Kludge is just a term meaning that there's a clumsy or an elegant solution to a problem. And a lot of people have thought of the human brain as just kludge, because a lot of the functions in humans that we have were not originally designed for that. And I'll give you a few examples of that. So they have kind of these constraints based on what they were first designed for. It's kind of like if you were trying to turn a hammer into like, a part of a broader machine that was going to, build a house or something like that. Like, yes, okay, the hammer could be used in that machine, but it wouldn't, if we could start from scratch and just like have, some kind of like a plan, we could probably have come up with a more elegant solution. So key thing to know about is homology. Homologous body structures, the classic examples is here, just showing that the bones in the bat, the whale, the cat, and humans all evolved because we all evolved from a similar ancestor, right? We're all mammals. Basically, the whale's fin is kind of just a riff on the bat's wing or the hand. So if you look at like the metacarpals, so the red bones, they're just quite elongated and thin in the bat, but they're short and stubby in the whale. They look very similar actually in humans and cats, but they're the same basic structure. And so what's happened is that an individual of a species had a variation that made them have a little thinner and longer wing. For some reason, that first organism that had that variation, that mutation, survived and reproduced more than that. And then if it was adaptive, then their descendant would also have a little longer and thinner metacarpal. And then their descendant, because it's beneficial, would then have more descendants as well. And so because of that, you get kind of what's called, drift of speciation drift, where species become less and less similar over time. but they're using the same stuff. And there's really good evidence that we all derived from a similar ancestor. If you look at the, embryo of a fish versus a reptile versus a bird versus a human in the first, several days of life, you can just see how similar they look. I mean, we kind of all evolved from the same ancestor, all life on Earth. Phylogeny is the study of how species diverged over time. So this is a phylogenetic tree here. It's also called phylogeny. It's just a phylogenetic tree is a diagram that depicts the lines of evolutionary descendants in different species, organisms, or genes from a common ancestor. So humans are up at the top, but you can see that we, shared an ancestor with a mouse, and we shared an ancestor with the elephant, and we shared an ancestor with a platypus, and we shared an ancestor with a zebrafish, and we shared an ancestor even with, tilapia, right? But that was many, many, many millions of years ago. And so the more similar, kind of the longer ago you diverged, the less similar you're going to be in terms of species. Questions about this? Yeah, we're good with this? So what does this mean for studying psychobiology, right? Well, let's use the example of oxytocin. So oxytocin, we think of often as like the love hormone, or maybe like a social bonding hormone in humans. And we think, oh, wow, we're so special. Humans bond. This is great. But actually, we share common ancestors. And did you know that reptiles also have oxytocin, a very, very similar hormone to it? And its first job in reptiles, and what it still does there, is it's a smooth muscle contractor. So it's a neuropeptide hormone that helps create like contractions in muscles. That's what it's first designed to do, they think. And that's what it still does in many species. However, in mammals and in animals that needed to gestate their fetuses inside. So a lot of, reptiles and stuff will lay eggs and things like that and can, give birth to babies that are quite small. And so they don't really need a lot of like force to get the baby out. But as soon as internal gestation came around and you got to push out these more developed offspring that are larger, oxytocin gets involved in contractions and labor. Still, it's a smooth muscle contractor, but it's kind of got this secondary adaptation, this secondary function. Now it's also helping with getting babies out. Then we got mammals about 1 million years ago. There was the first, we needed even more immature babies as brains got bigger. And so with the introduction of lactation, oxytocin then still is a smooth muscle contractor, is now helping with milk ejection. So now it's labor and milk ejection. Still no social functions, right? Then because oxytocin increases during labor and during lactation, it's a very convenient proximal mediator of maternal behavior. So the times in the lifespan when oxytocin's high is probably the times in the lifespan when you'd want maybe some maternal care. So because of that, because it was just, there were other hormones that could have been the ones chosen. So there was an adaptation or a mutation where for some reason, this one person's brain expressed receptors for oxytocin in areas associated with like pleasure and motivation in the brain. That first person was a better mom than the other person. And this wasn't in people, by the way, this is in primates. I shouldn't be saying people. And so they had an adaptive advantage. They were actually taking better care of their young than the other people. So that trait got passed down. And now we all have oxytocin. All mammals actually have oxytocin receptors in their brain. And when oxytocin's high, it facilitates caregiving behavior. In species, though, that it's so much work to have a baby, you actually need a buddy. Oxytocin also gets, I should say, it's a smooth muscle contractor. So it was also helps with sperm ejection and also orgasm in females as well. And so it's already increased when you're having sex, right? When you ejaculate. And so because of that, now we've already got this bonding function. Fantastic. Now it can also facilitate pair bonding. So it's going to increase maternal behavior, but also pair bonding in men and women. Then on top of that, now we got the fifth derived function. So there's already receptors in the brain for bonding in general. It's much more limited in most species, but now we've got these very complex social structures, and we might need to bond and form friendships and bonds to help us cooperate. Uh-oh, my internet's unstable. So at the end, now oxytocin increases like when, someone tells you they love you or a friend gives you a hug. But that wasn't the history of oxytocin. And so what it means so this is an example of serial homology, basically evolution, just tweaking something that's already exists and just making it have a slightly different function, or putting a receptor in a slightly different part of the brain. So it's having a different function. What this means, though, for example, is that, when there's all these like weird constraints, like, did you know that if you put lactating women in front of watching Oprah and they feel like, oh, so bonded with the story being told, they start ejecting milk? It's like a weird, because that's what its function. Did you know that, sometimes I worry about like preterm labor with women watching Oprah or whatever it is. So yeah. And that's why we don't give oxytocin. We always do pregnancy tests and make sure women aren't lactating if you give them a sniff of oxytocin up their, nose. So this is an example of a serial homologous traits, meaning that these share a phylogenetic lineage, and it's just been tweaked by evolution over time to now have this very complex social function. Serial homology of something like disgust. So the emotion disgust in the brain, it's first, we actually share disgust with every other animal on the planet can barf. That feeling of like, oh, so disgusting, and you're vomiting. It originally evolved to help us avoid toxin ingestion. So when you eat something gross, you feel the urge to vomit. It's associated with this behavioral and emotional state where you then are averse to eating that thing. Like, for example, if you ate something and then you immediately vomited, you don't go back to eating that same thing. Same thing's true of a lizard. They also have the same function. However, there's a adaptation for it to also be related to sexual behavior, in part because getting sexual diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, is very common. It's a very common way of getting diseases. So because of that, other animals find certain physical traits disgusting, and they won't want to mate with the opposite member of the sex. So if they had a huge boil on their genitals or something like that, a moose is not going to be that interested. So they want like cues of sexiness often are cues of, I've got a low pathogen load. I'm less likely to give you a virus if we did mate. So that's the kind of first derived function. After that, because it was helping to avoid kind of pathogens, sexual pathogens, it then got co-opted to avoid pathogens in general. And like the third derived function now is associated with like now it's used for very complex traits in humans, like avoiding association of norm violators or outgroup members. And you might be like, what? We're using like avoid this nausea response to be judgmental about, people like who are not supportive of transgender rights, for example. They think, marriage between same-sex partners is disgusting, right? A lot of disgust now gets used, co-opted in arguments of morality and things like that. And if you put people in an fMRI machine and you like have them imagine something they find is morally disgusting, so if they're completely against, same-sex sexual relations, and you show them a picture of that, the same part of the brain that's activating in response to if you show them vomit is activating when you're showing them a sex act between, not everyone feels that way. So it's just showing you that this evolved part of the brain is kind of leading. So what this means though is like you can actually decrease the amount of moral disgust someone has if you put them on anti-nausea medication. Jessica, your hands up.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused by the order of first derived and second derived because I would almost think it goes the other way, especially while you're like sexually immature and avoiding pathogens would be more like you come into contact with lots of people, but you're not going to sleep with every person you come into contact with. So I almost would feel like it would go the opposite way. So I'm just
So you
interested
mean
in,
the first and the second derived function should be flipped?
yes, not the original. Or like, how did scientists figure out that it regulates sexual behavior as the first derived and then avoid pathogen as the second derived? Is there like a
So
certain,
this is from Dan Fessler and Colin Holbrook, my husband. So this is what they think. But what's funny is I actually had the exact same thought. Like if I had to just knee jerk it, I would think, so I'm not like qualified to tell. So based on how they look at it, they basically the main way you do it is you look at the phylogenetic tree. And so you look at ancestors that have similar common ancestor and you say, okay, does this organism use disgust cues for sexual behavior? And I guess there's evidence that they were using it for sexual behavior before broader pathogen contact. And I don't know exactly how. I've not really read this is actually Colin's slide, so I'll take it up with him. Um,
I'm very curious in this one. I would love to see if they have a paper because that's just
Randy Nesse also has this order. He likes this too. So this is also from him. But you're right. But the idea here is that the takeaway is not what exactly evolved first, but more to an approach of looking at how existing functions can be tweaked to have a new similar function. So it overlaps with the old function, but it's new. Yeah. Um, I wanted to say really quickly that natural selection can banish dangerous traits. So if there is a mutation that would lead to, lower reproduction, it'll go out of the population very, very quickly. Even if a trait has like only a 1% will like reduce your rate of reproduction by 1%. In just 50 generations, you see huge effects where there's almost no one with that trait anymore. So it gets selected out very, very fast in the absence of these other three problems, which I'll tell you about later. But it can also lead to positive effects. So if you have a 1% advantage over having surviving and reproducing offspring, 100 generations later, you are hugely over. And so this are like modeling by like Andrews and Williams shows that just a little advantage gives a huge advantage over generations. But some variation is fitness neutral. So some traits, mutations just don't have that big of an effect on fitness. And that is good because we want genetic variation. That's the only thing natural selection can work on. So we like variation. Evolution loves diversity. They love it. Evolution needs diversity in the population in order for natural selection to take place. There was just some amazing data. Have you guys seen it? I heard it on NPR showing that one mutation led to like an over 40% increased survival rate against like the bubonic plague. So there was now a way over representation today in Europe of this genetic mutation that led to an increased ability to fight off the bubonic plague. And now pretty much everyone in Europe has this mutation. And there's been some work showing it also helped with COVID. So just showing like, if you get this environment changes rapidly, so you've got this new predator, a new disease that's going to wipe out incredibly deadly, and you have this variation, that leads to success, then those are the only people who survive and reproduce. And so they're all our ancestors, where all the people who died are not. So, but most variation is fitness neutral. Let's see. Okay. So we're almost to the end. See how simple this is? Evolution's so simple. It's so beautiful. I love it. So why has natural selections then? If natural selection's so great, Jen, how come it's left our bodies vulnerable to disease? Like, why do we get sick? Why do we have cancer? Why do, why do we still have dealing with COVID and things like that? Like, why are we still getting sick? Why hasn't evolution just made us have perfect bodies? Well, there's basically three things that make that impossible. So the first is evolutionary mismatches. We'll talk about those. That's when the environment changes so fast that there's not a variation that, if you're the first, population living in that new environment, yeah, in 100 years, we may have, natural selection may have killed off enough people that only the people who are now fit for that new environment are going to work. But if you're like us and you're living in the in-between thing where environment's changing so rapidly, you're going to get a lot of sickness and disease. Also, arms race failures. So this is when organisms reproduce, like, for example, COVID, or viruses. They're continually evolving too. And so our immune systems are also continually evolving. And so there's this kind of arms race between bacteria and viruses and humans, and stuff like that. There's also phylogenetic constraints and trade-offs, which I'll talk about in just a second. So evolutionary mismatches are when environments are changing too fast for evolution to keep up. Charles Darwin wrote, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change." And, Spencer came up with the term survival of the fittest. And what that means is not like the best, but the survival of those organisms that are best fit with their environment. So if the background environment's brown, better to be brown. If the background environment's green, better to be green. Less likely to, whatever suits that specific environment is better. That means that there's no good genes or good trait. It's just a good fit with the environment, a really important thing. So, I don't know how that happened. But so, evolution by natural selection, if we're looking at environmental change, that little wave, right? Environments do change over time, and they just change a little bit. They change over the year, they change over the day, and we're very evolved for those changes. For example, we have, a circadian pattern that helps us deal with changes in environment over the day. There's sunlight in the daytime, there's nighttime, there's not. And so we have selected, to specialize in day hunting. There's trade-offs in the ways that you can see at night. Organisms that see really well at night don't see as well in the day, and organisms that see really well in the day don't see as well at night. So we specialize for the day, so we sleep at night. All these, like, you can just see like how fit we are with our even small changes in the environment, like circadian changes over the day. But sometimes environments can change super duper rapidly. So when that happens, I don't know, I hate these animations. When that happens, the fit between the organism and the environment is bad, and it leads to ill health. So a classic example of this is, for most of our human evolution, we, had hand-to-mouth feeding. Like, you had to go out and hunt what you got. It was like you were living on, like, you didn't know if you were going to get your next meal. And so starvation was a real thing, and it was very, 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 very difficult to get high calorie foods. And if you did get them, you had to, like, to get a French fry, you had to literally go pick a potato. You had to literally kill an animal. You had to literally cut down a forest so you could render the fat, and then you'd cut it up, and then you'd do the French fry. So you get French fries, sure, you could do French fries, but it'd take you extra calories. You'd would burn off the calories you'd eat when the French fries, making the French fries. But now you can just go through a drive-through and I could get a 5,000 calorie meal if I wanted to today for about the cost of what it would cost me to work in an hour. So yeah. Because of that, we've got diseases of civilization like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease is not a problem for hunter-gatherers at all. Like, no, we never really had heart attacks before. That's because we were exercising a lot and eating a lot less and eating very different foods. So an evolutionary mismatch is when the environments in which humans evolved are very different than the environments in which we live today. When they are similar, when there's good fit between the organism and the environment, you get healthy organisms. But when there's this mismatch, you get a lot of weird things happening. And you can see that too in like a zoo, right? So you get a lot more, if you take an animal that's supposed to be roaming on, traveling 30 miles a day, a cheetah, and then you put them in a zoo, you're going to get cardiovascular disease and problems in muscle atrophy and things like that. Like you get in cheetahs because you change their environment. They should be running 30 miles a day. They evolved for that. Their muscles are built for that. Their bodies are built for that. They can't do that now. And so it causes problems. Environmental mismatches includes diet, activity levels, our social lives. We're supposed to be living in like groups of about 100 to maybe 300 people, 50 to 100, like 300 people. And now we live like, I could tweet something and it'd be seen by a million people today. I mean, that's crazy. We're not evolved to deal with these kind of large scale social, yeah. And yeah, dating apps are crazy. I mean, we're kind of supposed to choose from like the three hottest guys or girls, and you had like there's literally be if you were living in a place with 100 people, there might be like 10 people in your age group who you could mate with, and five of them would be male. So you can choose from like the five hottest guys. Fantastic, and you'd pick the best one. And like it's not that difficult to make that decision. Whereas today, and you'd be pretty happy if you got like the hottest guy out of the five. But now we just have so much choice. And literally there's thousands of hottest guys. And they're like, it's crazy. So I think we're messing with a lot when it comes to our social lives. And I think that could be why we're having so much anxiety, depression, and stress right now is a mismatch between our evolved psychology and our new social worlds. Childbirth is a big one. We didn't really have C-section deliveries. You would have just died in childbirth. I'm not saying that's better. I'm just saying, so for example, we get a lot of autoimmune problems, and I have a baby who was born by C-section. So I know that it's a bummer, but I'm glad I'm alive because I would have died otherwise. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying like my son Wilder is probably going to have issues with like digestion, autoimmune issues, thanks to his not going through the vaginal canal. Urban living is very crazy and complicated, living with millions of people nearby. Control of our fertility is changing our sex lives and our ability to have, we can have sex and not reproduce. That wasn't an option for most of human history. So I'll be interested to see over the generations, like what happens with our sexuality. And I'm guessing maybe even become more permissive, especially females having sex. And yeah, and now we live longer. So yeah. Questions about evolutionary mismatches? Yeah, stare at screens all day, right? I mean, yeah, right. Yeah, we didn't need like no hunter-gatherers need glasses. I mean, there are some, right? Because there are mutations that can lead to or developmental pathogens. Like if you get a disease at a certain time, it can actually really wreck your retina. You can go blind. I mean, there can be issues, but yeah, you don't get like nearsightedness and yeah. Um, So also evolution not working fast enough is arms race failures. This is bacteria and viruses. They're constantly evolving. We know with all the new COVID variants is a perfect example of that. They get better and better at getting into their host, which is us. And that's because of natural selection, right? Those viruses that can spread better are the ones who become the virus's ancestor. And so it's natural selection at work. So we're competing with other factors. Natural selection is working in other organisms. And so that can be why too. Sometimes we win, sometimes they win. COVID, they for sure hit it out of the park. You know what I mean? They totally won and have, COVID's taken over the world. It was a very successful adaptation of that virus. Not so great for humans, but humans have those who survived, are now going to be ancestors, whereas those who didn't aren't. And it's just a really sad, awful thing. I probably shouldn't say that. Sorry. That was, yeah. Okay. The second thing, which is actually more interesting, I think, is what's called phylogenetic trait constraints. So we know what phylogeny is. That's where, the evolutionary history of a trait and like how you shared kind of something that's already there. And so because evolution is just a tinker, it can only use what's there, and it's not like creating a plan out of nowhere. It has to just use what's already there. And so sometimes that means the design is not going to be optimal, and there's going to be design limitations that cannot be fixed, because in order to do that, evolution would just have to start over, right? So if you look at phylogenetic analysis, right, you're looking at differences in things over time. This is a perfect example of this is the human blind spot. So in humans, eyes have been evolving for millions and millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of years. Animals had, there's early prototypical prototype eyes, which are really cool. In like even in some like bacteria can be sensitive to light in really interesting ways. So the evolution's been working on this problem for a really, really long time. And so there's this blind spot. So if you put your fingers here and you go out, your brain will tell you that you can see it, but I'm not actually seeing the fingers right now. But my brain tells me I am, but I'm not. And so human eyes have a blind spot because of the retina being where it is and the lens being how it is. Now, if we could just start from scratch, and human engineers have designed perfect eyes for like robots and stuff that have no blind spots, you can do it. But just it's never going to happen for humans because it, evolution was just using and tweaking what was already there. Another example of this is back pain, right? Humans have a huge problem. I mean, back pain is, who's had back pain in their life? My back has gone out. Back is horribly designed in humans. It's designed for what? What is the back designed for originally? The back is designed for four-legged walking, right? So most mammals are walking on four legs. And so the back's doesn't need to be particularly strong when you're walking on four legs because you've got a nice table there. When you put it up there, you put a lot more strain on that same bone structure. And now if you think about a table, like how strong it would be if you're shaking it, the back's got to be, it's got to be way, way stronger. And so because of that, the back, and also there's limitations on how wide we can make the pelvis because we're bipedal. So a lot of people have hip problems, right? And so because if we could start from scratch and create like a bipedal, if we had evolved from a bipedal species, we had a common ancestor that was, a fish, if they were all bipedal from when they first got to land, we'd be in much better shape. But over time, it might get better, it might not. Another example, which Jessica put in the chat, is the human esophagus. So really not well designed. People are choking all the time, and we shouldn't really be breathing and eating out of the same hole. There's this little flap that goes down and supposed to protect us from food going down into our lungs, but of course that doesn't happen. And yeah, so fun times for humans. It's just it's what we got. It's what evolution can work with. Okay, so those are examples of phylogenetic constraints. There's often there's even vestigial structures. So these are structures that have lost all or most of its original function through the process of evolution, and so it's just kind of hanging around. So some people have argued that some things in humans are vestigial, like the appendix or the tonsils, but then other people have argued that actually they seem to have quite a few functions. So they're just maybe not like most important functions. Another example of vestigial trait on humans is human hair on the body. Like really, especially for women, right? We don't really have a lot of hair. It used to be for warmth. And pretty much it's just chilling there now. It's just vestigial, but we still got those little hairs there, and that's nice. Some people have argued that it's for sexual selection in men because some women find the hairy chest of a man attractive, but of course, yeah, to each his own. All right. And then the last one, and probably the most important evolutionary constraint that explains why we get sick, are these evolutionary trade-offs. So sometimes a trait can have a benefit in terms of one thing, like reproductive fitness, but it has costs on other types of fitness, other areas. As long as the benefits outweigh the cost of the trait, it can be selected for. So evolution doesn't have like a plan. It's not an economist, deciding what's the best thing. It's just, are they surviving and reproducing more? Yes or no. If the answer is yes, keep that trait. And so what that means is that, especially in terms of like long-term health and longevity, you get a lot of traits that were helping you to survive and reproduce when you're young that eventually kill you off. And this is because we've got pleiotropy, which you guys are familiar with. Pleiotropy is when a single gene has multiple effects, and happens all the time. Very rarely, actually, does a gene have only one effect. So one example of pleiotropy is in like this idea of a trade-off is when we look at sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is associated with this blood vessel, and your blood cell is sickle shaped, and if you have two copies of the sickle shaped allele, then you have sickle cell anemia. It's a very painful degenerative disease, definitely not associated with surviving and reproducing. But most people only have one copy because it's it's kind of still a rare trait. And so what studies have shown that people who are carriers of the sickle gene but don't have two copies are more likely to survive and reproduce in areas of the world that have really high malaria rates, because it's difficult for the malaria to do its full cycle in their bloodstreams. And so that's one of the reasons why it's thought that the sickle cell gene has actually been selected for, because it's led to survival in areas of the world where, and you do see this trait more commonly in areas of the world where there's more like bloodborne pathogens through mosquitoes. So here's just areas in the world with malaria and areas in the world with sickle cell anemia trait, and you can see very similar. And so another example of this trade-off is what's called antagonistic pleiotropy. It actually explains why we die, which is fun to know. A lot of times traits that have selective advantages in early life have health costs in later life. So for example, early puberty in girls is associated with early life stress. This raises girls' risk for reproductive cancers in later life, but of course they're reproducing quicker. And so because of that, it's leading to a benefit. Other examples are testosterone. So testosterone is actually an immunosuppressant. It's kind of bad for the male immune system, but males who have higher testosterone have advantages in terms of sexual selection. They're more likely to be chosen as mates, more likely to have surviving and reproduce offspring that are living. And so, yes, those males die quicker, but they're having more babies. And so it's selected for that trait. And so all these questions can be thought of in Nico Tim Burton, probably the most famous like life history guy, said we should ask these 4 questions about any phenomenon. And 2 of them involve the ultimate mechanisms, and 2 are the proximate mechanisms. So ultimate mechanisms are kind of asking the broader question of why did it evolve in the first place? Like how did it become selected for in the first place? And then the proximate mechanism is kind of how it actually leads to that change in the organism. So if we look at like maybe the ultimate function of oxytocin, or the ultimate function was, of putting receptors in the brain, was, and having it activated in response to social environments, it helped people collaborate because they were more bonded to these people who weren't their kin, but they could still, collaborate with them. And so because of that, bonding evolved in humans. The proximate mechanism, though, is an increase in oxytocin in the medial preoptic area in association with hugs, right? And there are 2 different levels of description, but they're not alternative explanations. And this is one thing I think people get really, really, really confused on. Like, ask yourself, if you have 2 explanations for something, really need to ask yourself, are they truly alternatives to each other? Like, are they mutually exclusive? Is it a zero sum? Or are you just thinking about different levels of just describing the same thing in two separate levels of description? So yeah. So it's not like we could say, well, it's oxytocin that's causing bonding. So why are you talking about evolution? Well, evolution explains why oxytocin promotes bonding. So it's not like there's an evolutionary explanation and a biological explanation. They both go together. So the four questions are two proximal. So what's the mechanism underlying the phenomenon of interest? So let's say, in this case, oxytocin in the medial preoptic area receptors, but increases in that. Great. How does the phenomenon develop during the lifespan of the individual? This is ontogeny. And so specifically, oxytocin is increased during times in the female lifespan or the male lifespan when bonding would be good. So because of that, it makes sense that oxytocin was not chosen, but became the proximal mediator because it was always increased when the behavior was needed. So it's associated with, birth, lactation, and ejaculation, all times where it might be helpful to be bonding with another person. All right, so ontogeny is really important to ask, like, how would this change over the lifespan? And so the idea that kind of evolution wouldn't take a lifespan approach, or would be kind of this idea that it doesn't take into account development, is what's called a straw man argument. A straw man is a fallacy where you take the weakest position you basically mischaracterize the opponent's position, and give like a worst possible you know account of it, and then you just knock it down. And that's really easy to do, and we see that a lot. And actually that's one of the tricks of debaters, right? Is you take someone else's position, you kind of it's true what you say, but you're not being fair to their position truly, and then it's really easy to just smack it aside. That's what I think happens a lot with evolutionary kind of people who rebuke the theories. They don't know enough about it, they don't truly understand it, and so they just give these kind of straw man arguments, and then yes, they're very easy to sweep aside. But yeah, ontogeny is a very important part of like how it develops over time is key. Ultimate questions to ask are, what's the function of the phenomenon? How does it serve the organism's interest? This is asking, like, how did it evolve, or is it adaptive or not? And then finally, how did the phenomenon evolve through different species? And so this is phylogeny. And so there's kind of these four levels of description. When you want to understand a phenomenon from an evolutionary perspective, you need to understand its phylogeny. When did the trait evolve? What was its first function? How similar is what I'm studying to other species or other ancestors? Adaptation, why did the trait get selected for in the first place? Ontogeny, how does it change over development? And then what's the proximal mechanism? If you can answer these Tim Burton's four questions, you'll have a nice evolutionary understanding of whatever phenomenon you're looking at. So we'll look at just a few examples of what I think is evolutionary kind of psychobiology done well. And we're going to look in my area of interest because I know the most about it. But there's also some really, really interesting work in this area. And so kind of thinking of the womb as a battleground, because there's a lot of mother-infant conflict in the womb. So this is work by David Haig. So mom and baby only share half of their genes, right? Because half of the genes come from the mom, half of the genes come from the dad. And the baby benefits from getting as much resources as it can from the mother, right? Because other babies the mothers will also only share half or even a fourth of their genetic material. So it's not like babies should be like, oh, let's save like mom's resources, all her vitamin D that the other babies are going to need to form their bones, because I'm only going to be half genetically related to those other babies or a quarter genetically related. And yeah, so I'm going to take as much as I can resource wise. Now, this is not conscious. This is just math. Mother benefits from modulating resources to the infant, depending on the infant's quality, meaning how likely the infant is to survive and reproduce and have kids of their own to pass on mom's genes, and also her future reproductive prospects. So if this is mom's last baby, right, she's going into menopause next year versus her first baby, she's 18, might be a different calculation about how much to invest. Same thing's true of like if you know think about your money like think about mom's resources like a savings account. Like if you're going to die in 2 weeks, do you want to spend all your resources? Yeah, you probably do want to max out your credit cards and do it. But if you've got like another 50 years to live, you probably want to save those resources for other decisions. Same thing's true in the math of mom's biology. And so let's look at a few examples of how these basic principles play out. So we'll first look at gestational diabetes. So gestational diabetes is a case in which the mom is not able to produce enough insulin for the to store all the glucose that is needed during pregnancy. So because of that, the mother has very high glucose levels and the baby gets extra glucose. This causes the baby to put on a lot of extra weight. And yes, while it's true, this may be bad for a baby's long-term health, you could see why a baby might want this strategy that, yeah, make me as big as possible because I don't know if famine's going to come or what's going to happen. I want the resources now. Yeah, it may cost me in the long term, but at least I'll survive. And we should also couch this in terms of 1 in 5 babies died in the EEA, so the ancestral environment in which we evolved, within the first 2 years. So infancy is a huge time, mostly due to malnutrition. So you can see why babies might be like, let's go for it, right? One of the big risk factors for this gestational diabetes is this human placental lactogen, this HPL. This is a hormone produced by the placenta on behalf of the baby, which will provide extra nutrients to the fetus. It can, moms if the mom cannot bind excess glucose, gestational diabetes emerges. And so by dictating how much of this human placental lactogen the placenta produces, the baby can actually influence the chance that the mom will have gestational diabetes. This is just a graph showing the amount of insulin that you need during pregnancy. So insulin levels have to get like 2 times normal, almost 3 times normal at the end of a healthy pregnancy in order to not have the mom develop gestational diabetes. That's because the amount of glucose that the mom's making and eating and needing to have the baby is huge, and so to regulate your blood sugar is just pretty much everyone's pre-diabetic by the end of pregnancy. I know I was pre-diabetic, and my sister's now dealing with gestational diabetes. Really, really common. 10% of women deal with gestational diabetes, and so women who fail to be able to produce enough insulin by the end of pregnancy, their blood glucose levels go through the roof, and the baby gets like a supercharged milkshake every day of just like pounding Gatorade in the bloodstream 24/7. And because of this, the babies get very, very large. And so here's a picture showing like a normal baby versus a gestational diabetes baby. They tend to be, the babies that are like 15 pounds, 16 pounds. These are ones they get really, really fat. And aren't they cute? It's so, 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 so cute. Not knocking gestational diabetes babies. These are beautiful babies. Love a fat baby. And yeah, but you can see the difference. So risk factors for gestational diabetes are obviously prediabetes, impaired glucose tolerance. So individuals, moms who have issues with, blood glucose in the first place are going to be at higher risk, but also maternal age. So a woman's risk factor increases as she gets older, especially for women over 35. And being overweight or obese or severely obese is also a risk factor. Now, we think about these as just like clear risk factors, but I want to reframe these a little bit in terms of this calculus of mom's best interests and baby's best interests. So pregnant women who carry 2 copies of the low activity form of the gene of that lactogen factor, which influences gestational diabetes risk, they do tend to have higher blood glucose levels, and it's a risk factor for gestational diabetes. But this genetic mutation, which increases your risk for gestational diabetes, actually first appeared about 8,100 years ago, and it's actually helped people survive a number of famines. So mothers who have this gene, their offspring are more likely to survive and reproduce when food is very limited. In the modern world, of course, this may lead to gestational diabetes, in part because of all our access to food. But during times of famine, this was helped babies survive. And two, when we look at maternal age, remember, you want to spend the rest of your bank account the closer you get to the end of your reproductive career. And so mothers who are older, who are going to have, they're over 35, they've got less time to have babies anyway, might as well give an extra glucose burst to those ending babies, because I don't need to save my resources for a rainy day. So that's gestational diabetes. And I hope what you can see that like a lot of the risk factors associated with it kind of fit in line with these ultimate factors. And yeah, so let's talk about preeclampsia now. Preeclampsia is another medical condition. It's characterized by high blood pressure and protein in the urine. It's actually one of the biggest killers of moms. And it's about 6 to 8% of pregnancies worldwide develop preeclampsia. And if left untreated, can cause seizures in pregnancy and maternal death, can cause fetal growth restriction and preterm birth. So we know that raising blood pressure of the moms helps. What does raising blood pressure do? Does it get nutrients to the place it needs to go faster or slower? Faster, yeah. It gets there faster, but there's going to be less nutrients given. So there's these spatial arteries that are special arteries that grow during pregnancy. And you can see on the top, that's a normal blood flow. It's a very big artery. It's giving a lot of good nutrients to the baby versus when you have preeclampsia, the arteries get very, very small. And so actually, although blood pressure is going up, less nutrients are actually getting through. And so preeclampsia is associated with fetal growth restriction and less growth. It's really the mom's body is cutting off, is like, hey, no, we're going to make the amount of nutrients I give to this baby less. And so there's been a lot of work showing that there's competition between the mom's genes and the dad's genes in terms of how much resources to give in pregnancy. And we know through epigenetics that parental imprinting, so the mom will put a certain amount of epigenetic tags on her genes she passes down, and the dad will put epigenetic tags on genes he's passing down. And they're not always in concert with each other. So parental genes are shared with the fetus, but not with the mother. And the interests lie mostly in the fetus. Like the dad doesn't have to contribute anything nutritionally to this baby. Like, let's make the baby as big and strong, take as much of the nutrients from the mom as we can. The mom, on the other hand, has to think about future babies that she's going to have. So she's going to be a little more conservative in the nutrients she's willing to give up. And so you actually see this. So if you completely wipe out the imprinting from the dad, babies are really, 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 really small. And if mom genes are allowed to take over, the babies are really small. If you do the opposite and wipe out all the epigenetic tags in the egg, the babies are huge because the parental epigenetic markers take over, are dominant, and the babies are giant. And so when you think about in terms of preeclampsia, obviously there's no advantage of dying, but maybe it's kind of the extreme of a distribution of moms attempting to decrease the amount of resources to the infant. And so there's been, because of evolutionary thinking on this, researchers thought, well, maybe moms will do this less if she's planning to have more babies with the same father. Is there such a thing, or if she's been exposed to the sperm before? If a father has several kids with a mother, then paternal genes might not benefit from injuring the mom as much, right? If the male has a long-term intention towards the female, then it actually makes more sense that he's going to try to extract, or his genes are going to try to extract less resources in this specific pregnancy. Conversely, if a mother might trust the sperm, so she's had sex with a partner for years, and now they're, having a baby, might this allow, we know this is a trusted source of resources and investment, maybe the mother will allow the fetus to take more resources. And so actually there's induction of allogenetic tolerance to paternal human antigen molecules in sperm is actually critical. So if a mom has never been exposed to the sperm of a male before, she's 30% more likely to have preeclampsia. And also, and we learned this from IVF experiments. So they did IVF, where like the mom, is taking a sperm donor, and so she's never had sex with this guy before. And you get a huge rejection rate and huge rates of preeclampsia and these kind of conditions where mom's trying to limit the amount of resources she gives to the fetus because she's never been exposed to this antigen in the sperm before. So women's bodies keep track of how many times and how recently that the moms had sex with the infant. Also, that these were guys who did this study, suggested that especially if she was orally exposed to the semen, much more likely to increase transplantation tolerance of the egg that's implanted by the sperm. Yeah. Also, risk factors for preeclampsia include changes in sexual partners, increases the risk of preeclampsia. If you have a one-night stand and end up getting pregnant, you are much more likely to get preeclampsia. The duration, the amount of time you spent living with the male is associated with lower preeclampsia risk. Condoms increase risk. So actually, if you've had sex with your partner for years, but you guys have been using condoms, and then all of a sudden you guys decide to have a baby, and so you stop using condoms. So the mom's never really been exposed to the sperm before, and hasn't been exposed to the antigen, it increases preeclampsia risk. So male reproductive proteins seem to decrease the likelihood of reproductive conflict over time. So if you're using sperms and if you're using condoms and you're not getting exposure to that sperm, it increases your risk. Predictors of preeclampsia include sperm donor through IVF really increases the risk. If you have a sperm donor that the mom has had sex with before or been exposed to before, it decreases preeclampsia risk and suggests that these antigens affect tolerance of sperm and possibly implantation of the embryo from a recognized male. So yeah, it's crazy. It's not something you'd predict, but if you implant an oocyte via IVF that doesn't share any genes with the mom, the rate of preeclampsia is 30%. So if you're getting an egg and a sperm that has no genetic kind of material in common with a mom, the mom's going to try to decrease, and not consciously, decrease the amount of resources she's giving to that infant. And so because of that, you get really high rates of preterm birth, intrauterine growth restriction, and preeclampsia. And lack of expressed maternal counteradaptations due to parental attempts to increase blood pressure are also a risk factor. Okay, we got lots of stuff in the chat. I see Jessica going crazy. Looks like people are just shocked by this. I mean,
yeah,
but
your internet was cutting out just for a little bit.
Oh no, I'm sorry, guys.
When you're talking about that crazy stuff about sperm, and yeah.
So the reason why I'm telling you this is just that you'd never think to test these hypotheses unless you had an evolutionary approach. I mean, really, it doesn't make sense otherwise. And then two, it's really good that we know these things. Now we know that the rate of preeclampsia is going to be 30% if you're not sharing any genes with, the oocyte or the sperm. We know that one night stands are going to increase your risk a lot for preeclampsia. So we can watch these pregnancies much more carefully. So yeah, fun times. The last thing I want to talk about is pregnancy sickness. Pregnancy sickness, for those of you who've been pregnant, you know that most women, well, about 50% of women will experience some amount of nausea or vomiting in early pregnancy. Usually the peak of nausea and vomiting in pregnancy is associated with the first 3 months of the pregnancy. Affects more than half of all pregnant women worldwide and is more common in the first trimester. In terms of the proximate mechanism of pregnancy sickness, it seems to be related to this HCG hormone. So it's produced by the fertilized egg after conception. It sustains fetal growth, and due to its high negative change, HCG may repel the immune cells of the mother, protecting the fetus during the first trimester. So it's actually also the mom's body will suppress. So the HCG from the placenta is produced by the mom's body grows a whole new endocrine organ during pregnancy. And the fetus really can influence what the placenta produces. The mom can also influence it, but the fetus has a huge impact. And so this hormone suppresses the mom's immune system, especially during the first 3 months of pregnancy. And yeah, and higher levels of HCG are associated with more pregnancy sickness, although not every mom gets it. Here's the relation between peak nausea and vomiting symptoms and levels of HCG. And you can see they're pretty highly correlated over the weeks of pregnancy. And so that's the kind of proximate mechanism, but let's think about the ultimate function. Like, why would this have evolved at all? Well, we talked about teratogens. These are agents such as viruses, drugs, radiation, food pathogen, anything that can cause a malformation in the embryo or the fetus. Foods are a huge form of teratogens for fetuses. So food poisoning, especially from meats, uncooked vegetables, are very, very dangerous. Any thing that's going to have a pathogen that could, lead to a problem in the baby's brain or development should probably be avoided, especially when we look at the weeks of kind of critical periods in development. So especially during the first trimester, basically every single organ in the body is being formed. And if you get exposed to a teratogen earlier in pregnancy, it tends to have bigger catastrophic impacts. So teratogen exposure in the first trimester can lead to spontaneous abortion. Teratogen exposure in the third trimester, still really bad, but usually is going to affect like central nervous system and brain development and stuff. Bad all the time, but especially bad in the first trimester when all these organs are getting made. And so if you look at the week-specific probability of pregnancy sickness, you can see that it tends to peak in kind of the like between week 6 and week 12 of pregnancy. And it's been associated, so pregnancies that have more pregnancy sickness actually lead to, I saw that I cut off like a lot of the really key slides, so I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to tell you. But pregnancies that have more pregnancy sickness, so symptoms, nausea and vomiting, it predicts lower rates of preterm birth, healthier babies that are larger. And so it seems to be protecting the offspring from teratogens. And two, when you look at the foods that moms are avoiding, the number one that moms say makes them feel like gross, two things: undercooked meat and vegetables. They hate raw vegetables. A lot of women are saying they cannot eat salads. I actually almost threw up. I actually had to run in the bathroom during pregnancy because I ate a broccoli and I just like couldn't do it. But carbs, a lot of moms will tell you, toast and butter, things that are less likely to be carrying teratogens are foods that, yeah, and these tend to be things that it's actually a human universal. So if you look at the foods that moms are avoiding all over the world, it's foods that are high in teratogen. So meats, number one, most common. Eggs, undercooked eggs, big teratogen. So a lot of moms aren't craving, runny eggs. No, but I don't know. Adi is pregnant right now. How's your pregnancy this sickness going?
Um, it was like being car sick the first few months. And now it's fine. But I can't stop eating carbs and chocolate.
You need that glucose for that baby.
Yeah, actually after that glucose test, like the diabetes, like gestational diabetes test, I thought I was gonna have diabetes because I felt so horrible like after drinking that disgusting glute juice and then not eating for like an hour. I thought I was gonna pass out.
I
So
had the same feeling.
yeah, I don't have it, but I am not surprised that I don't know, I feel like I'm a lot closer than usual to diabetes right now.
Yeah. Well, most women are at the
Yeah.
end of pregnancy. I mean, most women are like would score pre-diabetic levels of glucose if you tested them in the morning. Like, a few weeks, just your glucose, your insulin you have to produce is so much. But yeah, so pregnancy sickness, the ultimate function of it is to probably reduce women's like, cravings or going towards eating foods that would be teratogen sources. And then it's also very, in terms of ontogeny, we think about the time in the lifespan where this is most important. It's during the first 3 months of pregnancy, and when it's at its highest, that's because the immune system of the mom is suppressed and so much of fetal development is taking place. We think about it from, so we can think about it from Tim Burton's questions. Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, that's a good point, Jessica. Do I want to talk about this? Sure. Okay. So the last thing I'll talk about is preterm birth. Preterm birth is a huge problem in the United States. It's the number one killer of babies, actually worldwide. And so the question is, why are moms giving birth preterm? Can we apply this kind of evolutionary framework to understanding this? If you look at the rates of preterm birth, they're pretty stable over the last kind of 30 years. About 3% of babies are born, less than 34 weeks. Late preterm would be born between 34 and 36 weeks. That's going to be about, 7% of babies. And then there's a lot of babies that are born less than 37 weeks. So that would be technically preterm, but later preterm. So they're going to be much, much, much healthier. And actually, when we include all preterm births, anytime less than 37 weeks, the rate's somewhere between 10 and 12%. So it's pretty high. Like that's a lot. Like 1 in 10 babies are being born preterm, and preterm birth is associated with every negative health outcome you could possibly imagine. It's associated with especially neurological issues on the infant because so much of brain development happens in those last few weeks. It's associated with gestation. It's associated with diabetes and obesity because so much of the metabolic processes are kind of regulated those last few weeks. And babies who are preterm have to switch from getting their nutrients from the umbilical cord to food. And that's like, they're not evolved to deal with food yet. And so, yes, there's special milk that moms produce when they have a preterm baby, which is amazing. But of course, it's not, babies should stay in there longer. When you look at the predictors of preterm birth, this is from Chris Dunkelstetter. So I learned it like the knee of the preterm birth queen. Chris Dunkelstetter was, an emeritus professor at UCLA. She and her colleagues in like the 70s and 80s were the first people to show that psychosocial factors lead to preterm birth. No one had really ever found that before. And two, like it really was the impetus for kind of health psychology. It was born out of the fact that stress was a predictor of preterm birth. And and because it was so like every single study found it, and it's a huge effect size, and you'll find like if you look at how stressed a mom is in whatever time point in pregnancy and you correlate it with her gestational age at delivery, I mean, it always correlates. I've never seen a study where it doesn't correlate. So it's then no one could deny it. Like, yes, there's a connection between stress and our health, because stress leads to preterm birth. And so from that, then people started studying work stress and cardiovascular disease. So it's really a little history of science here in we can take a hat off to Chris Dunkelstetter, thank you, and many of the other researchers who kind of formed the foundation of biopsychosocial model. Okay, so when you look at the risk factors for preterm birth, they're all the things that would increase stress. So, major life events like death of a loved one, being homeless, getting physically abused, having high rates of pregnancy-specific anxiety. So if the mom's really worried about the birth itself or having to care for the baby afterwards, medical risks, so if the mom is told that she has a risk factor, the baby's sick, and so there might be a problem, that's going to increase her stress too. That also increases preterm birth risk. Racism and discrimination, personality also can affect stress processes, social networks and social support. So families that, moms who have more support are less likely to give birth preterm. She's also created this really nice model of how stress, influences the HPA axis, which we know about, and especially corticotropin releasing hormone, because the placenta actually makes corticotropin releasing hormone. So actually activates the HPA axis itself. Corticotropin releasing hormone, the HPA axis is activated like 100 times more at levels 100 times higher CRH would be than at normal time points in a human lifespan. So that's pretty crazy. And so then that might in turn lead to fetal stress and also preterm birth after it. So yeah, I guess I love Chris so much. And she is like mentor. She helped me get this job at UC Merced. But I would love to see kind of an evolutionary approach to preterm birth to help us make sense of like why stress would lead to preterm birth. And so really, what is the mom doing when, what possible advantage might preterm birth be for the mom? Like, why would stress lead to, from an evolutionary perspective, what advantage might it have? Like, why are moms' bodies doing this? And we usually think about it in just terms of like stress is breaking down the systems in the body. It's like a wear and tear model. It's just like, we think about our metaphor we would use, if you strain, substance enough, it can break, at certain. So that's kind of the model we think, the metaphor we're using in our mind are these physics models. And so you're straining and then break. But I'm more thinking about it in terms of like, if mom's so stressed out and she really wants this baby to survive, shouldn't she be keeping, and there's resources are less common, shouldn't she be keeping it in her body longer? I just think yeah. So some people have argued that moms are giving birth preterm as a kind of disinvestment in the offspring, not consciously, but because the infant's not going to survive anyway. Remember that like 1 in 5 babies are never going to make it for most of human history because there's not neonatal care units. And 2, the mom's got to keep up with years of lactation. And so, if she doesn't have to care for the baby, if the infant just dies, then she could reproduce again when, the environment's more favorable. And if she doesn't have the resources that she needs, it's kind of a Concorde fallacy. So if you like, the Concorde jet was this supposed to be this super fast airplane that would connect like the Europe to the US. And so the company that built the Concorde jet spent, millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to develop this amazing jet that could get you there so fast. The problem is that the jet and the fuel cost so much money to do it that there was no way to make the jet profitable. like they would have to charge, you know, $5,000 per ticket. And it was never going to be a good business model. So the Concorde company decided to go out of business. Even though they had spent all this money to make this jet, it was never going to be profitable. And we have to think about mom's investment in the offspring is the same way. Like, even though the mom's invested so much of resources in this pregnancy, right? She's grown a new organ, for God's sakes, to promote this, you know, to allow this baby to survive. If there's no way that the baby could survive and reproduce, not through any fault of its own necessarily, but also because of that, there are factors, genetic factors that also increase preterm birth risk. Then might be better to just get it over with sooner. The baby's not going to survive and reproduce anyway, even if she did give all the resources she could and lead to, yeah. So this is one of the things where I can see why this is not why people prefer this version of the story, which is just we don't talk about the ultimate reason why this is happening, because it's just depressing, and I could see people taking it the wrong way. Like, you know, if you had birth preterm, what are you saying? I'm, you know, disinvesting in my baby. It's obviously not conscious, but what we really need is like education about what, you know, the naturalistic fallacy and how just because something's natural doesn't mean it's moral or right, but there's just so much that goes into it. But there are, I could think of novel predictors that would follow from that idea that have not really been looked at. And so this is like a classic biopsychosocial model in health psychology. It's devoid of evolution. And I guess most people feel good about that. They're like okay with it because it's like it's getting us far enough. One thing I loved about working with Chris, though, is she was like open to it, and just had never been like convinced. So she's on like 2 evolutionary papers, and they're both with me. Yeah, wonder how rates have barely changed over time. Why didn't changes in civilization alter these rates? Wonder if the body is aware that preterm is influencing milk production and disinvests early. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. Yeah. So I know I was interested in that too, but they weren't really tracking rates of preterm birth until like the 1970s and 80s. Like, because in the 1950s, well, in the 1900s, before the 1900s, everyone was giving birth at home. And there was no, like, that was normal. The midwife would come over, you'd have the baby in your bed. They don't track, you know, and they didn't even have ultrasounds or anything. So they couldn't even tell if a baby was preterm or not. Like, they just see if it was tiny. And if it was tiny, well, then, you know, but they didn't track it. So we actually don't have good data on kind of preterm birth rates before these big things, changes of civilization even occurred. Preterm birth rates are going up a little bit, in part because moms are getting older since the 90s. But yeah, there's not great data on this. And but rates of preterm birth actually tend to be are really, yeah, they're different by country, but not as much as you would expect. Like, some countries that you'd think would have super high preterm birth rates because they have super high child mortality rates, they don't. So we don't really understand preterm birth yet. But I'd love to get like a true evolutionary function of preterm birth. Because you're right, Jessica, that like then moms are investing more resources for preterm milk. So it's not like they're fully disinvesting. Some people have argued that like Laura Glenn and Alicia Davis, who are really big researchers on preterm birth, have done some of the best work building the biological model of how psychological factors influence you know, CRH and other things. They actually think that it might not be disinvestment in the offspring on the part of the mom, that sometimes that the baby might actually have a better, especially those late preterm births. So after like 36 weeks, sometimes something might be going wrong in pregnancy. And so the womb's not like conducive to the baby surviving. So the baby's actually going to have a better chance out of the womb where the mom can produce milk. That's what Laura said, but I find that really, really hard to believe. Why not just have an adaptation that leads to better womb conditions or something? I don't know. So I don't really buy that.
Yeah. if that's true, then you would expect to see different composition in their colostrum and in their transitioning milk. You might expect to see like more antibodies in the colostrum, or maybe more days of colostrum, or even something like that.
You do. So moms really do change their milk. Preterm milk is so different than regular milk. The milk for preterm infants has way more antibodies, way more immune factors, is way richer in fat, and nutrients in general. Yeah, it's different. So it's not like they're disinvesting. So I don't know. But anyway, yeah. So that's all I've got. That's evolution in a nutshell, and kind of how it can be applied to building biopsychosocial models of really complex diseases like preterm birth, preeclampsia, and gestational diabetes. And obviously, I use this a lot in my work on like milk composition and how maternal factors might influence it, and how that in turn might shape infant trajectories. That's it. What do you guys think? Did I convert anyone? No. Do you guys know all this? I know, Jessica, you did. You were already converted, Adi. I know my grad students are already converted, but still good to know about the basics of it. Like you probably hadn't heard of like, Tim Bergen's 4 rules, or we'd been chatting about it. Oh, and Natalie's also a big Evo psych person. Danielle didn't know that much. So there we go. Definitely have given me a new perspective. Yay. Okay. Well, what I wanted to do with the rest of the time is just to open it up for discussion. Like I'd love to talk about what you're studying now, and like you think it maybe has nothing to do with evolution, but let's apply like the Timbergen's 4 questions and think about it through an evolutionary perspective, and kind of think about what questions we'd want to ask to give you a better evolutionary idea of what you're studying. Not to say that it's going to generate some, novel insight or whatever. But it sometimes can be quite useful. Like they never would have found out that, exposure to sperm was a risk factor for preeclampsia if they hadn't thought about it from an evolutionary lens. So let's go back to those 4 questions. So why don't we go? Yeah, go ahead.
It's not necessarily answering your question, but I've been having this question. How do you kind of figure out where the trade-off goes? So like when we were reading that article, there's like the trade-off between the specific and then the natural, right? Which kind of just makes sense as a natural trade-off. But I was trying to think about trade-offs in like reproduction. So if you stop investing in ovulation for a month, how do you figure out what the trade-off is and what you're actually potentially investing in? Or is that not the right thought process? Or kind of like I've just been thinking about that. Like if you're not putting your energy into something else, how do researchers kind of guess what the energy is going into otherwise?
Yeah, that's actually the biggest criticism of evolutionary approaches, is like, how do you know for sure that your kind of hypothesis is correct? Like it's really interesting, it can generate novel predictions, but how can you be sure that something was adapted for that, or like what the trade-offs would be? And so there's a really good, God, I can't remember the person who, there's a couple good papers on it, but from what I remember, basically you have to answer kind of Tim Bergen's questions, but so you have to do like most of the time it's through like a phylogenetic analysis. So you have to look at like every species that's similar versus different, and do they have that, specific selection pressure or not, and do they have the trait or not. So like, for example, we know that scrotum size in males is inversely correlated with the amount of sperm competition that is positively correlated. So you're going to get a much bigger testes size if females are mating with more than one male during a breeding season. And so there's beautiful data showing like that. So we know that testicular size is actually been selected for because of sperm competition, because there's just such a beautiful data. It's like the most perfect correlation you've ever seen. And so when you actually look at like, you know, you can kind of then infer the amount of sperm competition and how much females like mate with another male that they're not supposedly. So in primates generally, like, you know, chimpanzees, humans, you know, there's the male that, you know, the woman's spending a lot of time with and is mating with a lot. But how are you sure that actually she's not sneaking off in the bushes and having sex with other guys and then cuckolding the male? So having the male, you know, give protection and resources to an offspring that's not hers. And so like when you correlate the amount of extra pair mating that females do, it correlates beautifully with testicular size. And actually silverback gorillas, for example, have really small testes. The males do, because there's not a lot of extra pair copulation. Actually, their testes are way, way smaller than human testes, even though their body size is gigantic. So they have this tiny little testes. If you look at chimpanzees, they have the hugest testes. I mean, they're giant testes, and humans are about in the middle. And so about 14% of babies born in humans, the mom says one guy's the father and he's not actually the father. So about 14% of the time. It's more like 20-30% of the time in chimpanzees, and it's almost 0% of the time in silverback gorillas. So I don't know, just an example. But like, how would you tell a trade-off? I mean, like, how would you tell about like, you honestly speculate and then you try to come up with testable hypotheses, like what would be true if that was the case. So like literally when I was coming up with the new helper at the nest hypothesis, so we had this really weird data set where we were finding that stress in pregnancy was related to if mom was stressed in pregnancy, their offspring, if they were female, were going through puberty, adrenal puberty, which is about social development, sooner, but not gonadal puberty, which has to do with like having a baby sooner. And so I literally just sat around and was like, what could possibly be happening there? So like what ultimate function would that have? And so we read Haig's work, and they were saying that maybe under stressful conditions, moms would have want a helper at the nest. And so maybe moms are speeding up the reproduction of their female offspring so that they'll have, you know, a helper at the nest sooner. And they're not doing that with male offspring because male offspring aren't specializing in that type of care very often. And so, okay. So then I asked myself, I came up with predictions about what could possibly, so if that's true, what could possibly be an ecological factor where that selection pressure would be even stronger? And that's where I thought of, okay, firstborn girls. Because if you had a baby, if it was a firstborn girl, then you'd have a helper at the nest for all subsequent children. If you're doing that for lastborn girl, that wouldn't make any sense. What do you need a helper at the nest for if there's no kids? So you follow it through to predictions, and then you further refine and test your hypothesis. It's actually not that different than any other scientific. I mean, how can you be sure that, you know, a factor is going to be associated with another factor? All you can do is like test it, operationalize it, and test it. It's just a scientific method. So I don't think it's really fair to hold evolutionary psychology or biology to a higher standard. But yeah, evolution's a theory like climate change is a theory. I mean, there's just so much data to support it that it's just comical to object. It shows ignorance. And so that's why I think it's funny that most psychologists like hate evolutionary approaches. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't really think psychology is going to be a true science until we integrate it with the rest of science. It's like if a random branch of physics was just like, we're just not going to think about relativity. Like, no. Our theories don't have to be in line with the rest of physics. We're like our separate thing. We're like, you know, physical physics, we're like chemical physics, we're fine. Like, we don't need to think about this other stuff that everyone else knows to be true. And so the truth is, like, I feel like psychologists are a little bit are like ostriches with our heads in the sand. Like, they don't want us to be animals because it's like sometimes it's an inconvenient truth. Like that there's parts of human nature that are probably ugly and are hard to change. And it's like really sad to think about moms just investing in babies and killing their babies. Like, it's horrible. So I get it. I get why we don't want that to be true. I get why we don't want to think about it, but we're never going to be taking, like, some of the people who don't think psychology is a science, I don't really blame them, because, you know, our APA manual was literally written by a bunch of like white guys deciding what the human mind was like. And here's a disorder and this is a disorder based on their experience. No scientific, like, now we test different disorders and stuff, but that's why, like, when NIH has been so frustrated, that's why, like, psychological science is so stunted, because we've been using these categories based on no science, just like what these, you know, clinicians thought was a disease. Then you go into the brain and it has no correlates. Like, there's no depression kind of, you can't look at an fMRI and tell if someone's depressed, but probably because depression's not a real disease. Like, in terms of, that's not the right category of description. If we were just letting the biology tell a story, there'd probably be like problems with reward processing, problems in affect, you know, problems in motivational structures, right? And we call that, okay, you're depressed, you're not, even though the two people have, you both have problems in reward processing. So just, I don't know. I know I'm on a tangent. I'm sorry I'm on my soapbox, but I can't tell you how frustrating it is that most psychologists just never even think they need to learn this stuff, because it's like denying climate change and then calling yourself climate scientist. Like, you just couldn't do it. It's kind of like calling yourself a scientist and just denying evolution as a psychologist is like just crazy to me. So you should at least make sure that your theories are not at odds with other things. Like, the first thing I would do if I was studying a phenomenon, you know, that was like, I would try to see what's the phylogeny of it. So whatever brain structure I'm studying, whether it's like, you know, risk-taking behavior or drug processing, I'd look at the structures in the brain that it's acting on. And then I'd look at the animal studies on it, you know, and kind of decide, like, I'd ask the question. So what, you know, how does development affect it in other animals? What's its potential function evolutionarily? Like, why did, you know, humans evolve to let these drugs cross the blood-brain barrier and influence us in terms of making it rewarding? It's probably pathogen defense, right? So I think I've told you guys this before in issues, that actually these things of that, like nicotine, cannabis, their THC, these things are actually toxins that plants produce to try to kill. They're actually deadly in high doses. And so plants are producing these, but for some reason humans have decided, and a lot of animals have decided, especially if they're very, very large, to let these chemicals act on the neurotransmitters to influence dopamine. And there's no reason it had to do that. That's actually an adaptation. These chemicals can be kept out of the brain. And actually, we shouldn't be attracted to these neurotoxins. And so one idea is it's this pathogen load idea, that we were using these neurotoxins in low levels to keep down pathogens like helminths and other worms and stuff that we were dealing with. So if you know, have a lot of nicotine in your blood, all the worms in your body are keeping your worm load low. And so there's really interesting work on that. So that if that's true, then actually cues that your worm load is too high are going to be associated with your cravings for those things. I mean, it has all these really interesting implications. Certain medications are actually going to, that would, you know, depress signals that you have a like high worm load, would actually lead to like less behavior. And then two, you have to ask the question, it's an evolutionary trade-off. Like, is actually, yes, it's true that these, you know, imbibing these substances is negative, but might there be another consequence of not having these substances, especially in places where pathogen loads are quite high? But I don't know. I'm going to stop talking. It's just hard. It's hard for me not to talk too much because you guys all have your cameras off. So I'm like, I just keep going. Also, I love to hear myself talk. Obviously, a professor's a perfect job for me. I think we can all agree. Yes, but I would like to, yeah, Jessica says we're not like other scientists.
I was being sarcastic because we were talking about psychologists. I was like, we're not like other sciences. I was just being silly.
Yeah. What comes from this idea, a lot of it is religious, I think. of this idea that humans are special and that, you know, we were made by God, and that, you know, there's a lot of religious undertones there, and we have souls, and they, you know, our minds are reflections of those souls. And so the religious influence on, you know, the human and psychology has been stronger than it has been on other sciences. Like religion didn't have a lot to say about like eukaryotic cells and, you know, their like pathogen protection or whatever. So evolution was fine to work in those fields, but it's still pretty controversial in humans. Um,
I went to a private school, K through eighth, a private Christian school, and I was not taught evolution or actually science until I went to a public high school. So I didn't even learn about evolution until I was probably 15. And the way that it was taught was so wrong compared to how it is. Like they said, an alligator wants an apple from a tree, so it stretches and becomes a giraffe so it can get taller. They lie to you about what it is. And so
that's the straw man. So they give you a
uh-huh.
false view of what it is, and then they say that's stupid. And that's Lamarck's idea, and he was like, but actually there's epigenetics suggests that Lamarck is not completely wrong, that actually experience can change your gene expression, and that if it happens in the gametes it can be passed down. So it's actually not as crazy as it is a thought. Oh, Danielle says my nana used to call it evolution. Yeah.
Yep.
She was super religious, so
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of religious people who are cool with evolution, and they're fine with it as long as it's like God is the one who's the tinkerer. So instead of there being a blind tinkerer, it's God's the tinkerer, but these are his natural laws that he's set down. If it's a he, I don't know, that she set down. And so, yeah. But so some people can rectify that. It depends on the gods you're into, right? So I come from, Colin was got a BA in religious studies, and so we educate our son about all the gods. And I've actually got a god in my workroom here, Tara, the goddess of wisdom. She's a good one of my faves from Tibetan Buddhism. But yeah, so, and I don't mean to, you know, poo-poo. I'm actually quite agnostic myself. I have enough respect for, you know, the stuff I don't know to, I'm not going to say anyone is wrong, but I will say that the laws of evolution are, I mean, you only need three things and you get speciation. I mean, I think that's, and there's so much work. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of studies that have tested these, you know, laws and shown, and they've actually like made new species in the lab. You can do that by, you know, isolating a population, changing the environment. You get a bunch of, it's usually fruit flies since they reproduce so quickly. You can get very, very different things. They've done experiments where, you know, you know, it's kind of common sense too. You can, I think you guys can all understand it. It's more, and then two, the classic distinction between the brain and the body and psychology. And this kind of idea that like our psychology is like a ghost in a machine. And so, you know, there's these ideas that, or that the brain evolved to be general purpose. And so some people are fine to let evolution handle everything from the neck down, has been shaped by evolution. But the brain, we don't like that. Or maybe the brain just evolved, like maybe evolution just gave us like logic and intelligence, and then that's what we're using. And so that they're also cool with. Like evolution has given us kind of these broad kind of traits that make us uniquely human, and that's good to go. And they kind of aren't thinking about the fact that like when you put someone in an fMRI machine, they're literally using the same parts of the brain that they're, you know, to think about physical pain, that they're using for social pain. They're using the same parts of the brain that they are thinking about barf to think about religious disgust. Or, you know, I mean, the parts of the brain, there's evidence, so much evidence of homology. It's like crazy. The brain we use, like, that's why metaphors are so important to us, right? We use, like, the way we use our abstract thinking and logic, we use a lot of parts of our brain that we use for spatial reasoning. So this is all stuff from cognitive sciences, because I live with a cognitive scientist. But so much of our metaphor is like, it's overwhelming me, or it's like, I'm getting in over my head, is like this idea that something's higher than you are. It's a trickle down effect, like the logic of, and we are literally thinking about like the same part of our brain that we're using to reason about, like trickle down economics, is the part of the brain we're using to think about like water going down a surface, like literally. So we call it logic, but we're actually just using like really basic motor structure functions to think about these really abstract things. So I actually don't think humans are evolved to be smart enough to understand our own brains, which is fun, but happens with tide pools in islands. Jellyfish get stuck in little lakes during floods. Yeah, you can see speciation that way, which is kind of depressing thought. It's like, I'm stuck in my Homo sapien brain and I'll never understand it. Just like an ant could never understand its behavior, it just wouldn't. Maybe ants do have thoughts about their behavior and some amount of self-consciousness, but we wouldn't. I don't know. It'd be really interesting to study humans from like a alien perspective. I'm sure they'd have so many insights.
You ever seen the videos and remake dam their little new area? Actually do anything so cute, and I
Sorry, your internet's cutting out, Jessica. You're frozen right now. Sorry, you froze. Uh-oh. My internet's unstable too. Uh-oh. Can you guys hear me okay? Well, I want this to be a safe space where you guys can talk about, your exposure to evolution, or your kind of, if you have any like reluctance, or was anything I said like sound wrong or was surprising to you, or oh no, I'm not coming through. Am I frozen right now? Here, I'll take off my camera. We'll see if that helps. Can you guys hear me now? Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe it's hard to have like a good discussion when everyone's freezing. So I'm sorry for that. It's a bummer. One limitation of Zoom for sure. Does anyone want to talk about anything, or should we just call it a day since we're having Zoom issues? No questions. All right. Okay, well, I know you could talk about it for hours, Jessica, so could I, but maybe give people time to process stuff. But my takeaway is the only thing that I think can bring this all together is evolution. So yeah, that's my takeaway for today's lecture. And then on next week, we're just gonna do review. So I'm gonna give you guys a Jeopardy game, and then I want to go over some of this like stuff we covered a long time ago. So the class is cumulative. If you guys want to do the class, those of you who may wanna, isn't presentations next week? I don't, is it? I mean, you'd think I'd know this as your teacher.
I
Yes,
mean,
it is.
yeah, it's the 14th, I thought. Yeah, I'm presenting as well, Adi.
Are you? Okay. Sorry. I got my dates mixed up here. If it's on the syllabus, that's what, is that what it says? Here. Let's look. So are you guys ready to present next week?
I think mine might be a little longer than 30 minutes, but yes.
That's okay. We have more time. We only have 2 people scheduled. Yeah, you're right. Yes, you're right. Oh my gosh. Okay, yes. And then we're doing, that makes so much more sense. Then we're doing the review and final exam right before the final exam. That makes so much more sense. Okay, so Adi and Jessica, you guys need to get your presentations together. And then, sorry, Natalie, I misspelled your name here. And then the next week on the 28th will be Danielle, Natalie, and Selena. All right, cool. And so Jessica, what are you going to be presenting on?
The HPG axis throughout the lifespan.
Cool. And so the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis.
Yes.
HPG, not HPA. Great, because we didn't really cover that. So that's awesome. And then Adi, what is your presentation going to be on?
It'll be on nutrition, microbiome, and mental health. And
Oh,
cups.
nice. See, that's why I'm so happy to hand the class over to you guys, because your interests and expertise are so much cooler than the broad stuff I'm giving you guys. So yeah, exciting. Hey, Mila, were you saying hi?
She was just saying cups over and over again, right, Mila?
Cups.
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 Yeah, I don't know why. Yes, cups.
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 Are you
Mila,
feeling sick, Mila?
are you a little sick, Mila? She's shaking her head no, but that's not true.
Cups, cups, cups. Well, actually, Adia and Jessica, both of these would be good slides for you guys to make, given that probably be a large component of both of your job talks. So won't be a waste.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys. Well, I'll see you next Monday at this time. And I'll be excited to see the presentations. And yeah, thanks for listening. And I'll probably have to upload both of these lectures to YouTube. So I will go ahead and do that now. And yeah, just give it up. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your week.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye.